Hello, everyone. Hello, welcome to the fourth lecture in our monthly lecture series. My name is Sylvie Andrews, and I'm the director of the Gresham Historical Society. It's really exciting to see some new people here. I am going to give a quick plug for our membership program. Our members get to attend these talks for free, and there are 12 of them over the course of the year, so that works out to a pretty good deal. A membership for an individual is only $25. We're currently in our 2025 membership drive, and if you join before April 30th, you will be eligible for a free membership with the Oregon Historical Society, which is offering us a reciprocal membership offer. So you can join either on our website or here in person. We've got some brochures, and Linda can ring people up. So in addition to that, we're having a drawing for a gift basket at our annual plant sale in a few weeks. So if you join by April 30th, you automatically get entered in this raffle. And that will have some museum merchandise as well as gift certificates. And you also get a free hanging flower basket at our plant sale. And in addition to that, you also get 10% off in the museum store and a subscription to our quarterly newsletter. So lots to think about. So now I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. LaVerne Lewis. She has an amazing background of leadership in our local community. In addition to currently serving as the director of TriMet, she founded Women Sew Global Foundation to give women practical business and leadership skills, particularly immigrant and refugee women. And she's also a quilter. So everybody, help me welcome LaVerne Lewis.
Thank you, and it's really wonderful to be here. So many faces, wow. First, I'd just like to say thank you to my president of my quilt guild, who's here in the front row. So it's like, oh, Trish is here. And she's gonna kind of be my little helper today. Thank you, Trish. But thank you for being here, taking time out on your Saturday evening to come and listen to stories of my stories of a lady that I will introduce to you, which is my grandmother, and her stories of how she explained them to me. Or, you know, when you're 8 years old, you listen to Grandma, and she tells you stories. And it wasn't until, I was at Craft Warehouse, I believe, and they did the underground quilt, and I started getting little triggers of memories of stories that she told. And then over time, I think as the older you get, you know, pushing 70 myself, things you start remembering, especially when they pass and you go through some of their old things that I'll talk about later, but the memories come back, and then you remember some of the things that are hard. So I do have a disclaimer. Sometimes when I'm giving this presentation, it sets off a few triggers that I'll remember and kind of get teary. I'll be okay. I'll just kind of swallow and step to the back. I got the tissue. I had to go search for tissue. Thank you for the tissue lady back there, Linda, who had some tissue. But thank you for being here. As many of you know, unfortunately, our history of Black Americans is just being removed. And so deep in our hearts, it lives with us, and regardless of taking down websites, removing books from the library, those memories are with us, and I would love to share them. I'm going to enjoy sharing them with you today, and I got to stay on task because I get carried away. I'd also like to thank, and I will send them around, the Multnomah County Library. Our librarian was wonderful in bringing forward the books that are available on, not necessarily the Underground Railroad, we all know about that history in Harriet Tubman, but how the quilts connected with that. And so I will send them around, and feel free to go over to the library and check them out. But I have a few, but they had quite a few, and there's a CD. that's included as well. And so as I'm talking, some of them are children's books, and I am an educator. One of the things that was not in the introduction is I teach at PCC. I also teach at Mount Hood Community College. And I'm an educator, so I find those books and send them around. And there won't be any homework. There will not be any tests. Well, there might be. I will test you on the coded quilts, but we'll talk about those a little later. But I'm sending around some of the books that to look through and enjoy, and feel free to check out. Let me start this one, and that's the CD. The lady I want to share with you from my heart this evening is my grandmother, and on the front of your handout is a little information about Jessie Mae, well, she was Dews, but Jessie Mae Walker, that's her maiden name, which was my grandmother. And she was born in slavery, and a lot of times we hear about slavery from various different sources, but I will pass it around. I have brought the picture of my grandmother and her mother, which were slave descendants. My grandmother is the one on Bessie Mae's, which is in the handout. She is sitting on her mother's lap. And I know them as the tallest one with the missing face is Aunt Sister. Aunt Emma's on the far side holding the doll. She was a nurse. Aunt Belle, and Uncle Buddy. Uncle Buddy's the little boy standing on the rock. I knew them as adults when they came out of the South to Grandma's house. My grandmother was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There's stories on the Tulsa riots that I've learned later, but came out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and moved to San Francisco. In San Francisco, her and Grandpa bought an old home. In San Francisco, those were the old Victorians with upstairs, downstairs, stagecoach going through the center. It was huge, and my grandmother brought in boarders, African Americans that came out of the South, coming to California for gold and for working as the longshoremen and the jobs. And so my father and mother lived downstairs, and there was always 3 or 4 roomers, not rumors, that, book-checked places in. And so I'm going to send this to the back, let the back get the part. That helps you to take a look at families that are descendants of slaves. How many of you remember in your grandmother's room, because I'm dating us, grandmother's room, she had that big trunk at the foot of the bed. Yeah, we all kind of remember that trunk. In that trunk was where Grandma kept the knitting, the old quilts. She kept her crochet needles, some private things, and at 8 years old, I discovered that it was open. One day when Grandpa was asleep from a shift, my grandmother would be what we all saw The Help. That's Hollywood's version of those who worked in homes. My grandmother was a professional mammy. A mammy, if you kind of remember your African American history, worked as a housekeeper in a home. And I remember her many times washing, ironing her white uniform or black orthopedic shoes, which I got to polish, and wrapping her head in a red or white scarf. That was tradition. But she was a professional mammy, but she was gone that day, and she left her trunk open. 8 years old, little girl. Yeah, you get to go in Grandma's trunk. Getting to the bottom of Grandma's trunk, I heard a noise, and I didn't know what it was, but I had moved some things in the trunk, moving the quilt. Quilt was old, of course, it was very, very smelly at the time. But underneath the trunk, I discovered that I didn't know what it was, but it had the energy that was very fearful. They were the lady in the picture that's coming around, Grandma's mama. Remember, Grandma's the baby sitting on Bessie's lap. They were her mother's slave chains. They were her cuffs. And I learned from Grandma, because, you know, you find these, the energy did not feel comfortable, but I wanted to know what they were. And at that time, about 8 or 9, is when I began to learn the stories of what it was like to live in the South and have great-great-grandparents that came out of slavery. So today we're going to look at some of the stories that Grandma shared with me. And it wasn't like one sit down and she shared. They came when grandmother grew up AME, so of course Saturday nights was getting ready for church, you know, the chicken frying, baking of the cakes, getting up crack of dawn, baking the bread. Members of the household, the tenants downstairs coming up for food. So Sundays was very, very busy in the house. But so the stories were over a period, I would say until I got 15, that I learned the full impact of quilts and how they serve. Now, we know quilts today as, you know, those $3,000 and $4,000 quilts, some of them $20,000, that win prizes and awards and we get excited. And I call those the good quilts, the ones we make today. So what we're going to look at today are what I would consider the working quilts, the quilts that had jobs. And that job for those quilts were some of the codes that were embedded. Now, there is, if you do your research, you will see that there's a kind of some research on quilts did not help slaves make it to the North. That is, there's a lot of research on that, and I've been asked about it. And my response is, I'm going with what Grandma told me. You know, I'm sorry. There may be, but Grandma's stories were very real, and they are lived, and they were from her relatives that came out of the South, and she is very deep in her history. So I'm going with what Grandma said. So today I'm not quoting from any of the books that I shared, but my grandmother's stories. Okay, and I'll take little questions later. So someone asked me, and I did send it around, how do you know your grandmother was in slavery? And I go, well, I got a picture here and I can share it with you. And I do have another small picture to show you Grandma and why she was a mammy, very feared. The little girl in the picture is me on Easter. Okay, and I'll send it on the other side. There we go. And of course, I had on the gloves and the pearls. It's Easter time. So the trunk at the foot of the bed had a lot of different quilts that had codes. And so it took some time, but when slaves were first brought over, weaving was very traditional, and it was known as mud cloths. It's very heavy. It does smell when you first get them. I brought this one out of Tanzania many years ago. Does have to air it out, but you can see, and please feel free to come up and touch. I don't bring things people can't touch. You don't need white gloves. This is not a quilt show, okay? This is real show. Well, I shouldn't say that. Sorry, Trish. But it is a mud cloth, and the print on it is mud. Remember, there are certain dyes, the cochineal beetles, the walnut. So kind of think of the indigenous plants. And so it was a tradition to put codes. These are cowrie shells, and it was pretty much used. The 4 talks about a travel. So this is a traveling mud cloth. When I was in Tanzania, the women that came that were a collective of basket weavers carried a lot, and that's how tribes identified tribes, or what you were doing, by the symbol that was on your mud cloth. And so it's very heavy. You'll see some of it made in, on cloth, stamped on regular, our fabric that today. But this is woven, and those are cowrie shells, and this is considered the crossroad. And we know that in one of our, I didn't put up, well, I'll put the crossroad up, of traveling and getting ready or moving. So it's very durable. It does carry warmth. Thank you, Trish. I do have the crossroads up there. Yeah. And so the crossroads was one of the symbols. You can see the symbolism in the cowrie shell of the traditional pantheon of the Yoruba language was Legba. Legba to us is the trickster. But he always waited at the crossroads. And we'll look in a minute at, a couple of minutes at a quilt. But the crossroads is where there was either danger, you're going to change paths, or I'm trying to think of, Grandma always called it change of directions. One of Grandma's superstitions was never pick up pennies. You know how you see pennies on the ground, you get up, don't pick them up. It's like, I used to pick them up. She goes, they change your path, especially if you find them in the crossroads or on the corner or crossing the street. Don't pick them up. They're left there to change your path. Just good old black superstition, urban. I don't know if it's true, but I don't pick up pennies when I find them. One interesting thing is when I was in Cuba 2 years ago, I usually take teams on missional trips. We came to a street, and there was on the corner a altar. And of course, some of the folks in the group were like, what is that? Because there was a little food, a little candle, some cowrie shells. Remember, a lot of the slaves went into Cuba. 80% of the slaves out of Africa went to the Caribbean islands, into Brazil, into, I forget the other island, before they even came to the United States. So a lot of the traditions are still practiced, especially in Cuba. But I said, don't touch that. You don't want to touch that. You don't know what you're messing with. But it was fascinating to see the practice. So crossroads can be a place where you find symbols. Grandma said crossroads can be a change of your life, or for those that were traveling, it was just you needed to know which way. In some books that you will read with Harriet Tubman, she always left the group that she was moving from south to north at a crossroad, hidden. That way they could see her coming, or she could see if it was safe in all directions. So you might see that terminology there as well. Okay? In your handout, I know that's the teacher in me, sorry. I'm trying to follow your handout here. Okay. You have a variety of different symbols. I didn't bring them all, but the next one is one that I grew up with, and that is the monkey wrench. The monkey wrench is one of, traditionally on plantations in the South, blacks were helpers known as blacksmiths. They weren't allowed to take tools, but they were allowed to use tools, repairing the different carts, taking care of the irons that were for the horses in the cotton fields. And so this tool represented, if they saw in quilts, meaning it was time to gather your tools to move. Okay. That wasn't a story from Grandma, but one I picked up. So I'll kind of remember to tell you which ones I learned from her and some that were specific. One that I did learn from Grandma, which really stuck out, was the wagon wheel. One of the things on plantations is when the master went from plantation to plantation, of course, he had the horse, the cart, and when it was time to go, they were usually spokes, and I kind of looked up, I didn't see a wagon wheel, but you will see wagon wheels and church irons. If there was a piece of white cloth tied to a spoke wheel, that told the slaves in the field Harriet was coming. That was her symbol, that she was coming. You didn't know if you were going to be on that train that was leaving, but she was coming, and that was one of her symbols. That one I do remember. So if you're working in the field and here comes the slave master, remember he had quite a few fields that he traveled around to. So this is one way messaging passed from plantation, if he had several cotton fields with slaves, by someone tying a little white cloth on that spoke. And that's how one-way messages carried, from plantation to plantation. I see a question. I don't know. Oh, her question was, they never caught on? I would say maybe yes, maybe no. There were slaves that were definitely would tell. I mean, in all societies, there's those that would, tell on the slaves that were getting ready to leave. But a lot of the reasons this history is just pretty much oral, like I'm sharing, is it wasn't talked about. You just didn't talk about it. I mean, that's why my grandmother's stories to me were over a period of time of one, thinking that I could understand it, especially from 8 through 15, and the dangers of even talking about it. There was death, fear, loss of limbs, horrors of being left and separated from your family. It was a dangerous journey. I mean, we can't even imagine today what that journey would be like from coming out of the south to the north. But the wagon wheel is one of my favorite. It's kind of similar, not quite a Dresden plate, but it's pretty much on the round scope. Okay. Sneak past you there. My other favorite is the bear claw. Grandma, this was another one of the ones shared by my grandmother, was bear paws, or, left prints. We're not looking for the bear, but if you followed, you might find food, depending on when and the time of year. Usually with, the flying geese. I don't have a flying geese, but flying geese pretty much are flying south to north, north to south, but bear paws usually meant follow for food, especially if you were out of connection with whoever was leading the train south to north, or you had to forage on your own. Bear paws is really a common one that you would see in quilts. Where were these quilts? Well, I think Grandma said that a lot of times folks didn't know, but in the time quilts were made, they were always hung out to dry. Not dry, air, thank you. We didn't wash our quilts then, because they were either, they're what you had the old trundle, but they were not hand knotted. If you're familiar with quilts, they were heavy, hugely heavy. But bad English there, hugely heavy. Well, heavy, yeah, heavy. And so they were either hung out the window, off the a clothesline, across a tree or a fence. And so I think the adoption of what was in the quilt was helpful, because remember, those families hung those same quilts. It wasn't like us where we can whip out a quilt in 2 months. Not going to happen. Those quilts took 1 to 2 years in the making, and if you had family members doing it in a group, then it took 6 or 7 months. So that quilt had tradition. That quilt had blood in it and sweat, and it covered, and it was for the winter time. And so that family may have had that quilt for 10 years. And so imagine different groups of slaves coming through. There's that quilt, which meant you turn at the corn post. And so I had the same experience when I was in Tanzania, and there's no street signs in the city that I was. It wasn't really a city, it was a village. And the kids told me, well, you go down to the cornfield and then you turn and you will see the cloth, and usually an African cloth, it's the oil. And then you turn right there, and then you go down, and at the goat's farm you turn, and then you'll see the school. And I'm like, okay. Well, I got lost, of course. So each morning when I was teaching English to the kids, they would meet me at the cornfield, because there's no maps, none of that. And that is, so therefore they came with this skill of how to read trees, bear paws, quilts, cloth, things that were hanging, signs that were left by last traveling groups of slavery. Okay? I'm not going to do all the ones in the handout, but just some of my favorites and Grandma's favorites. The next is the log cabin. Safe house. This one I knew from Grandma, and that was the safe. That was my first quilt square that I learned, which was a favorite. Well, it's easy. You put the center, and then you fold, and you sew. And that was one that she taught me. I did it usually by hand. But it is basically symbolizing that this is a safe house, or a house that will feed you, or a house that you will stay. One of the treats that I have brought tonight, before I go on to the next quilt, and my grandmother, and you can touch them, you don't need gloves, but these are my grandmother's hand squares. They are old, very old, and you can touch them, and touch Grandma, okay?
So when did your grandmother pass away?
Let's see, I know this. San Francisco, I left in '86, so Grandma passed away in '82, because I came here in '84. When I went back to sell the house with Grandpa, yes, you can, yeah, because there's plenty. Thank you, Trish. I found these in the trunk, the smelly trunk, smelled like old mothballs. The quilt was gone, don't know, probably some aunt relative had got the quilt was gone. I did not know and have a attachment to these, but I kept them. And then sure enough, later on, I ran across someone who says, you should quilt. I went, oh, okay. And then, then a whole new hobby, addicted hobby was born. And then I went, oh, I remember Grandma's squares. You don't have to organize them, just pass them on. That's okay. I know that quilter thing, we get going, but you can tell they're very old. Some of them are pretty fragile. But I want you to touch Grandma. Pass them on. You got to share. Okay. I know, it's like, ooh. I mean, some of that fabric is like...
It's so classic.
Yes. Yes. And she was doing the stars. Yes. I mean, we can't, yeah. Thank you. Yes, you had a question.
Did she buy fabric to make that, or was that just for the clothes that people no longer wear?
Old fabric, I don't know where she got that fabric. I know when my mother and her taught me on an old trundle, 2 wedding dresses later and much, maternity clothes. It was saved from flour sacks, especially the white. My grandmother, being a mammy, would bring home things that she would take apart because the family she worked for, that's kind of where my name was. Justin Tavier out of San Francisco, the French hospital that's there has a wing dedicated to him. My grandmother was his mammy. And so they had, nice finery, and Grandma'd bring it home and take it apart. So kitchen curtains, things of that sort, and that's probably, I'm going to assume, because I don't know factually. Good question, thank you. Okay, watching my time, how am I doing? Good? Okay. All right, log cabin, and then wagon wheel. I'm missing someone. Monkey wrench. Carpenter's wheel. Another favorite. Another one meaning getting ready, compass. It also was used as a star. We also know the evening star following north, the Big Dipper. There's been a couple of movies that have portrayed reading the stars. I always put, the 3 wise men following, the eastern star, as you hear those as in Sunday school, until I was in Jordan. I know I travel. And I was in Jordan, and I was in the desert. And when you're in the desert, after 3 days, you don't remember your name. I mean, your senses shut down because there's nothing to see, nothing to hear. Yes, there is a song by America, You've Been to the Desert. It is very true. I mean, your perception. And then I had this sense of smell that perked up. And on the real horizon, you can see, you lose perception because the sand and the sky blend until sunset. And then there's 2 suns because of the reflection. But it was a Bedouin group coming to visit us. And during their presentation on animal husbandry, camel husbandry, the whole thing on Bedouin tents in the desert, someone asked the question of, well, how do you travel? There's no stop signs, because they considered themselves the Amazon of the desert, because they brought all kinds of stuff. And they said, we travel by the stars. And then, in the desert, big sky like Montana, it was like, well, of course, I wasn't familiar with the constellation out of Jordan, but it was like very real of traveling by the stars. And if they have been traveling by the stars in the desert for millions of years, I am sure black slaves could figure it out. Okay. All right. And so the carpenter's wheel is another pattern, very popular, and it goes with the song of Steal Away. One of the songs that my grandmother sung, especially when she was hand washing, I learned to wash my Sunday white socks on those little rubber boards, in the sink, and we had one of those old Ringer washers and dryers. But the song that she sang often, and it always comes to mind when I'm doing this presentation, is "Get on board, little children, get on board, little children, get on board. Little children, there's room for many a more. That is the song that was sung on the plantation when it was time to go. And if you've heard that song and know the words, that is an old getting ready song, okay? The other, My Temptation, where's my, oh, Trish, can you grab the, we're gonna flip. Another one in your square is the tumbling block. Got it there? Perfect. Did I put that right? Oh, I have it upside, that's okay. Well, you still get the perception, yes. This one, I thought one day I would try the tumbling block. It does have another symbolism. It's in your handout. This one I created. Very hard to do. So my kudos go to those that did the tumbling block. But it was another get on board, blocking, boxing up what you're going to take with you. It was also seen in some of the books. There's one book I will send around that I have tagged some of the pictures of hidden in plain view. And I truly believe that a lot of the folks who hung their quilts out had no idea. They were just hanging them out, that they were signs and symbols for folks passing through. Yeah. Okay. But this one I highly recommend if you want to go into the codes that were in quilts. So now comes your test. Then we'll have questions. I think I've covered everything. Oh, I forgot my other fun book, sorry. Okay, for those of you that want to make a railroad quilt, this is highly recommended. It walks you through some of the quilts. I'll pass it around. This one's mine. You can get this, get it used. There are plenty of them out there, but that one's very helpful. So now comes the test. The next quiz, or the next quilt was done by the Northwest Guild, and when I saw it, I had to buy it. It's like, oh, because it had symbols in it that were really what we've learned today. And I want to see how many of you now that you've got your quilts and your cheat sheets, can help identify some of the symbols. Not all, but there are some. Oh, we do have it sideways. Okay, well, use your imagination. We know what this one is. Yep, wagon wheel. Yep. Crossroads. Bear claws. Okay. See the carpenters.
Was the carpenter's wheel the one in the upper corner, and is that the wagon wheel second then?
This is the wagon wheel.
Okay, and what's the one below it?
This is a Dresden plate. Not all of them are part of. I just saw that there. I got the quilt, of course, hearts. No, I mean I got that because it was symbolic of the quilts that I had seen in reading a lot about coded quilts. And this is a good example that even today, this quilt was done maybe 6 years ago when I was helping with the Northwest Quilt Guild. I belong to that guild. The blocks are still very popular today in our traditional quilts. You will see them. I mean, I took a class at the big quilt show in January to learn the Dresden plate. This is hard because to get it to lay flat after you've put this on. Now, it was nice because the lady did it by hand, but when you're doing it by machine, it can move and do all kinds of things, and then they're supposed to go together. And so it can be representative of, I would say if they saw the wheel and saw both, I would say that it represented the wheel. Yeah. The star, of course, we didn't have the butterfly. There isn't a log cabin, but I love the bear claws. And so what drew me to this, and I use it in presentation, is that there's so many of the symbols we saw today still being used in the quilt. Now, when you go to the next quilt show, you're going to be looking like, oh, yeah. She says, oh, yes. Because I know, I've seen that particular one. Yes. Okay, I think watching our time, I can answer some questions. I think everyone has touched Grandma's squares, fondled them. Yes, oh, okay, great. And Grandma's picture is floating around somewhere. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Questions?
Were any of the quilt blocks that they used, like the hair paw, the crossroads, did the people create those specifically for the Underground Railroad, or did they already exist from earlier times?
I'm going to say from what I've learned, they were already created. Remember, slaves didn't have sewing machines. Slaves didn't, I mean, they may have helped with the creation, but I would say the plantation owner had the ability to have a hoop and do hand quilting and have, the ladies come over for tea. Whereas most of your slaves were in the cotton fields. So they weren't creating the blocks. So that's what I'm saying, hidden in plain view, folks who truly owned quilts would hang them out, and they became symbols. Certain ones pulled from them and suddenly became markers of how to move from south to north. Bear claw. And so you had to teach the next group coming through, moving through in slavery, what to watch for, how to move. Birds will, when we go back to the elements, very Native American, birds would tell you, especially geese, fly north and south. If you're traveling in the winter, which is very rare, usually it's summer, the spring was the best time looking for berries. Watch for the bear claw, because bears come out of their hibernation and are eating. Best place to look for berries, follow bear claw. I think there was another song down by the riverside, Trouble the Water, that is, the dogs are loose, and so therefore you need to stay by the water because dogs lose the scent when you go into the water. Bears, there's another animal symbol I can't think of right now. The house that possibly will feed you and hide you. Remember the Aborigines that helped probably had a log cabin or something in their quilt. I think over time they discovered that slaves were using their quilts for symbology and actually put things. I do know when I owned a store, I would give out food, and I learned there were hobo markings on the front door. And so many of us remember, that's where you go. Churches used to have them. This church would help you, would feed you, would hide you. And so I learned that from, you talked about earlier my women's sewing group. A lot of them are Ukrainian ladies. They do have symbolism of their leaving Ukraine and getting here, and different churches, especially Orthodox, if they will hide them or help them. That is still very live today, but we don't know about it because we're not in that mix. Yeah. Very good question, though. Yes?
I have a question about the transition from hand quilting to machine quilting. In your grandmother's case, she started quilting by hand. It sounded like maybe you did too. And then,
Well, I wasn't quilting, I was sewing. But I learned, my grandmother had quilts. I was busy making aprons and doll clothes at my age. Wasn't a quilter, but I was hanging around while they quilted. My grandmother quilted, my mother quilted, but it was mainly for bed quilts. They weren't putting symbols in. They were pretty much the ones that you saw, the stars, and basically the fabric that they could get at the time. So a lot of it was hand, but my mother had a trundle. So I pretty much learned doll clothes. That was my favorite. I mean, my doll was the best dressed doll ever. Yes. Aprons, we wore aprons during that time. My mother made my Easter dresses, so it was mostly clothes when most blacks at that time couldn't afford. Or they took apart or repurposed. I mean, that's a new term today, but back in the day, that was what you did. If I didn't like it, I either shortened it, or added something to it to make it really cute for school. Good question. Others, oh, come on. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Question.
Yes.
These symbols, were they only on quilts or on the underground? Did they paint some of these symbols on barns or buildings so people on their way north could, not look for a quilt, but maybe look for one of the symbols?
I don't know, but I'm going to put it into a context that makes sense. Quilts could come in and out. So if there was a group of slave catchers that were out, the quilt could come in. Putting a symbol on a building it has to be out of sight. You can't, but stop here, slaves hanging out here, I would say probably not, but I know drawings in the ground and dirt. Trees were markers, but remember, if slave left markings, slave catchers would find those as well. So it had to be mobile. Quilts were mobile. They came in, they came out. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
One of the books says the color made a difference. That, for instance, in the log cabin, if you read the whole thing, I'll check it out for sure, but it said that the color in the center was bright.
Yes.
That was different than if it was dark, because if the dark meant they were safe.
Yes. And she's talking, most log, well, if you're a quilter, you kind of know. Usually you're going light to dark, but if the dark is going, if this was dark going this way, I learned that this was good. I learned the opposite. So, the book is okay. It just depends. Because remember, slaves were moving all over. And so Harriet Tubman was not the only conductor that was moving slaves. Some slaves left on their own. And so when you see log cabin, that was basically put in the quilt by the home so slaves would know. So some quilts were just assumed, and then when a slave owner, especially those that were helping and hiding slaves, their quilts had meaning of stop here, don't stop here. So there was so much coding at the time. For my grandmother, it was the ones that were safe. I'm sure there were not safe, but her stories pretty much carried the ones that she knew from her mother and what her mother used. Remember, slaves, there wasn't a newspaper or an internet to let them know what to look for. So one or two or a whole family moving may have known only two symbols. Look for the bear claw in the dirt, because they knew that they're not going to see it on a quilt, and check for a log cabin. They may only had two signs. The wagon wheel pretty much was what they used, and that could mean trouble, and it could mean time to go. But there were a lot of time to go symbols. That was time to move, or Harriet's coming for the next group. I'm trying to think. And then songs. Songs are just as, a lot of your old spirituals, yes, a lot of the traditional black, they call them Negro songs of the time, were slave songs that had messages. Go Down Moses, Way Down in Egypt Land. That's another Harriet Cummings song, Harriet Tubman's Coming, or Get on Board, Little Children. A lot of those songs were sung in the field. carrying messages. Yeah. Great questions. Hopefully. Yes, ma'am.
Was there a guide with most or any groups, or did they just have to figure out the trail? They couldn't be on the roads,
No.
the trails, it was all in the woods.
Thankful for bears and geese and flowers.
Were the houses close enough to connect messages between the houses and?
Not really. But plantations were huge. And so I mean, I can't say what we see in Hollywood, but if you go to the South and do some of the plantation, once in a lifetime, at least go and do the plantation. It starts, I think, in deep Alabama. Someone is doing the G's Bend quilt book that's floating around, started out, and you can do the slave route. There is one with markers and everything. Takes you about 5 to 6 days, but we would drive it. I mean, remember, they're walking and totally different terrain and everything. Plantations were huge. Remember, you had anywhere from 50 to 20 to 30 slaves, which with little cabins, huge fields. The cotton fields were huge. And it depends. One of the other ones my grandmother talked about was bow ties. I don't have a placard, but that is in your handout. That reminded me, thank you, of bow ties. The reference that's there for the bow tie, hers was a little different. It was meaning the bow tie meant you're coming to a city and be careful, not dress up and look, I mean, because slaves, I mean, when you're a slave and you're traveling, you don't have good clothes. You're doing good to have food and to get through wherever, which meant there's a city coming up. That's how my grandmother saw it. When you're getting ready to, remember, back in those days, you dressed up to go shopping. Remember, I mean, I'm sure a lot of us, that you didn't go, dressed up. And so the bow tie meant there's a city coming up, take the long route. So symbols.
So avoid the city?
To my grandmother, from her story to me, was they avoided the city.
Right, because who would have the clothes to fit
Right.
and you would stand out and be
Yes. There's a little reference in the movie, the popular movie of Harriet Tubman. There's a little reference where she dresses up. A lot of women were able to move because men's clothes were readily available than women's clothes. So a lot of slaves dressed up as males to easily pass through the city. Dry voice there. Other questions? Let me see if someone else has. Yeah. Oh, in the back there, anyone? Don't be shy. Yes.
When we talk about symbols and the meaning of the symbols, how does the slaves learn the meaning? Is it passed down through oral tradition?
Yes. But she asked the question, how did slaves learn? More of that was learned once you got to the north, you passed it on to those heading back, right? Because once you got north, you weren't going to take everything you learned to go back. So I think in the movie, Harriet Tubman's movie, remember they would gather, organize who's going back, collect information, network, slavery network, to get data, which passed, and then the next train would go back for more slaves. So they called them conductors. I mean, that was the code term, conductors going back. My grandmother technically was a conductor. I learned, this is all, I would say in the last 20 years, the boarding house that her and Grandpa bought was helping blacks come out of the South. Now, they were free, of course, but they had no means. And so they shared a bathroom. I remember the bathroom downstairs was kind of creepy, but they had divided 3 of the bedrooms on the lower, there was those old cold water flats with the radiators. It was an old Victorian. They were huge. But they divided up the rooms so the person, whoever the roomer was, had bed, a little sink. So they were little rooming. And Grandma would cook, feed, they paid her for food, and she helped them get works. And then usually about 6 or 7 months, they moved out. And my mother was the cleaner and prepper of the room. So there's a couple of movies of, blacks that have boarding houses. I think one is called Lackawanna Blues. Reminds me of, how you gentleman's nodding, reminds me of my grandmother's house. Different roomers that lived there, mostly single males, very few. She lived in Fillmore. That was the day when Cadillacs were huge. I remember my mother helped clean the room at the Booker T. Washington Center when Lady Day came to sing. I remember Martin Luther King coming to preach. So San Francisco was a hub for black families coming out of the South. Boom. Those memories, wow. Little girl. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So how does your grandmother's family, how did they come out of slavery? Were they just freed at that point and then they went to California, or what?
That one we're still trying to figure out, because the mystery, my brother and I haven't figured out how my grandmother and grandfather could own and buy a boarding house in San Francisco, not the marina, but where they got the money. We've traced it far enough to know that my grandfather had, 17, they had huge families, you saw the picture. And they came out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which gives us we don't have, because a lot of that was burned, that they were part of those that left Tulsa, Oklahoma from the Oklahoma riots of Black Wall Street. Because there's no sourcing on how they had money to come to San Francisco and buy. And I found their deed. It was 18, I don't remember. And it was like $19,000. And they bought this, it was like, right now, well, when it sold, it was like millions in San Francisco. It was one of the old gingerbread homes that they had decorated. It was huge. So it had like 6 rooms upstairs. Back then, they were old, big Victorians with the carriage under where the horse would go back in that day. We just can't fathom. And my grandfather's sister, baby sister, owned a flat, which I inherited at the great age of 19. So here I am, 19, with this pair of renters, and no clue. I managed with Grandpa's help, but I lived upstairs and my brother lived downstairs. But we didn't think about that then. Now that, remember, a lot of Black history is not existing. It's written out of history books. I never knew about the Tulsa riots until last 20 years. It was like, whoa, right? Didn't know about that. So putting those parts together, because blacks did not have funds and, generation wealth and any of that. So I would say they transitioned my Bessie was out of slavery and then freed slaves. And then my grandmother growing up, marrying my grandfather and coming with all the sisters. Most of the sisters, Aunt Belle, Aunt Sister, cousins, Opa Faye and Stella Mae, they stayed. Yeah, Opa Faye and Stella, yeah. And Ruby Jean and Ruby Pearl, those, yeah, all those cousins stayed. Even now, I go to Texas. My brother moved back. He wanted to have a cultural experience. And so I have country cousins, and then we have the city cousins, and it's quite, I can only do about a week. It's very, one story I did want to share about the cuffs, my grandmother's cuffs. So Growing up, I came out of the 60s. I grew up in the 60s, San Francisco, with, Haight-Ashbury, and there was this guy in the park that was blowing up his guitar. Little did I know now, flash forward, it was Jimi Hendrix. We used to cut school and go down to the park to watch this guy blow up his guitar. But the high school I went to, George Washington, was for kids with issues. Very few, we think we had some token white kids, but it was made up of black kids like myself, Jewish kids, which their families, Holocaust, Japanese. San Francisco has a huge Japanese, and they came out of the internment. So you had some pissed off kids, and that was us. And that's why we were there. And so I had a boyfriend, and he was Jewish, but we couldn't talk about it. Now, I hope someone here would correct me, but his wife-to-be was considered a shishka, but we were a secret boyfriend and girlfriend. Well, we decided to bring things to school because we were organizing a sit-in. Back then you organized. And I brought my grandmother's cuffs. Well, I was on punishment for two months on that one. But I brought her cuffs to school to show, my friends, my, renegade friends here. And he brought the patch from the Holocaust from his family. And some of our Asian friends, I kind of remember, they brought something, but I think back, that was one of those flashback memories, that triggers of, little did I know, looking back, that history of, I just didn't want to go to the school, but those were my buddies and friends, and we were highly pissed. So if you look back to that generation, we were kids that were angry and had a lot to be angry about. And that was when I became Negro and transitioned into black with an afro. And that tore up, I was on punishment all the time. My father was Martin Luther King, and we were proud Negroes. Well, I was black because, Huey Newton says we were black. And so that was the transitional time. And collecting the data from the quilts was part of that. And I remember you're recording this. Oh, hi to the I'm sharing some of our family. So. Other questions? I think our time. Yes.
I'm curious if you have other family members that are as interested as you are in figuring out your grandmother's, how they ended up with this, in this financial situation. That is such a story.
Yes and no. I'm the oldest. I'm the girl. I'm the oldest. There's like 6 years between myself and then my brothers, which are a year and a half apart. So, yes and no. I have 3 brothers. I have pastor brother, gangster brother, and one brother doing life, and he did pass away. So, a big variety there. Yeah. Different generation. But no, my oldest brother visits, and we have just suddenly decided to dig into that. Still a lot of fear. He lives in the South. I mean, it's like totally, different, but he pastors there, but more embedded in the black culture there of what's discussed, and what's not discussed. And there's a lot of that history that you only discuss when you're among other blacks. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
So do you know whether or not they own land in Oklahoma?
Well, I do say on my mother's side, we do have a family. It's not giving oil, but I knew growing up, a lot of the blacks did have oil wells. And in Louisiana, on my mother's side, my grandmother is on my paternal, that's my father. My mother's side came out of Louisiana, so that is where some of the cultural, she was French Creoles. So my mother passed for white. That's how she got jobs in San Francisco. Her grandmother passed for white. Her mother was French, and she was from France during World War I and came here with a, so you can see in our family we get darker, darker, darker because my father is very dark, my mother's very fair, and so my mother became black during the 60s. Yeah, she stopped passing. No, but she did, that was just her sisters. They were all very fair, so, and they passed for white. I look at the, family pictures like, first it was like, that's your grandmother, but on my mother's side, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
I was just fascinated with your necklace, because it looks like cowrie shells.
They are cowrie shells, yes, yes. Thank you.
Kind of not on the subject of the quilts, but when I was in elementary school, I grew up in Tillamook, and one of the most impactful books one of the sisters read to us was Black Like Me.
Mm-hmm.
That was such an impactful book. Just
It was Black Like Me.
Black Like Me.
The author?
I don't remember.
Black Like Me. Dick Gregory, yes. Thank you. Thank you.
That was, I mean, I still.
That was the book of the times to read. Yes, it's still. I think it's on the do not read list and remove, off. Yeah, it's one of those, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm, yes. Many of them. Yes. So thank you, everyone. Please support the Gresham Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight. So again, we've got a membership drive on right now. Our lecture next month is going to be about Walter Quinton Gresham, who is the namesake of Gresham, Oregon, but is much better known for his term as Secretary of State of the U.S. And developing foreign policy towards China at the time. So. Yeah, it's going to be tough to follow up this talk. That was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. We've also got a historic downtown walking tour tomorrow, starting here at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll be looking at mostly historic architecture in downtown Gresham. A plant sale on May 9th and 10th, also here at the museum. And there will be 2 flower crown workshops. If you want to know more about that, we've got some flyers up at the front. And then we also have a series of cemetery tours coming up. So lots to do. We have an email newsletter sign-up sheet in the front. So if you want to keep apprised of everything we have going on, feel free to sign up for that. And again, thank you all very much for coming. And let's give Dr. Lewis one more round of applause.